So welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you. And as I mentioned before, Shelley and I have been working together on topics that would be helpful to present to the student affairs, through the student affairs assessment workshops. So today I put together a presentation for types of assessment. We've talked a lot about surveys, and today we're going to go beyond surveys, in particular to talk about rubrics, the use of rubrics and focus groups. So, got to do my assessment thing, set out the purpose and goals of the workshop, which are twofold for today: to provide information and guidance regarding types of assessment and situations in which you would use an assessment tool other than a survey, and then again to focus on focus groups and rubrics. Okay, just some general assessment things. Here are our topics that I just want to touch on today. Why assess? Why do we assess? What are the components of the assessment cycle? What is effective assessment? Developing an assessment plan, types of assessment, and then focus groups and rubrics. So why do we assess? Obviously we assess because we want to continually improve and to get a gauge, to measure our progress and our programs and what we're doing. And then, of course, we have to be accountable to some of us to just internal organizations, to internal groups, and some to both internal and external. And then, of course, just to respond to the increasingly pervasive culture of assessment, which I belong to some listservs, and it's just amazing the growth that I see on a month-to-month basis. So the components, just want to hit on the general components of the assessment cycle. We define, step one, we define what those learning outcomes are. We're defining, why do we run our programs? Step two, we assess them. Step three, review and discuss. And then we go to step four, implement changes. And the cycle starts all over again. So it's all about that continuous improvement. What's effective assessment? Well, ideally, we want to have it be systematic, continuous, so that we're, continually looking at our programs. We want to build it around the department's mission statement. We want it to be ongoing and cumulative, multifaceted for sure. We don't just want to do surveys, because that gives us a singular perspective. Surveys are great, but it's helpful to go beyond that and get different types of input. We want it to be pragmatic. We don't want to do assessment that after we do the assessment, we can't do something with it. So it should be pragmatic. What are we going to do with it? How can it be practical to us? And then designed and implemented by the program and not top-down. We don't want somebody above you saying, oh, go do this. It really needs to be organic and come from you. What are we assessing? We can assess a number of things: knowledge, skills, values, attitudes and perceptions, and departmental processes. So you have to think about what we're assessing with each of our types of assessment. The developing a comprehensive assessment plan, this comes from academic program review assessment, but obviously it applies. In looking at your programs every year, you may be able to develop quite a few learning outcomes. You may have 10, 20, 30, but to be effective and realistic and pragmatic, it really helps to define 3 to 5 per year that you're going to really take a look at, assess, see how you're doing, and implement change if necessary. And so for each of those, when we work with the academic departments, we encourage them to come up with an assessment plan. So for each of the learning outcomes, they need to identify the method of assessment. Are we going to do surveys? Are we going to, for academics, pre-post evaluation, capstone projects? What are the achievement targets? Do we want 80% of the students to reach a certain goal? What are those achievement targets? Of course, we'd love to have 100% success in everything we do, but not realistic. It could be realistic, depending on our program. And then those assessment results. The assessment plan should document what the results are from our assessment efforts, and then what we're going to do with that. How are we going to use that? There's more information about comprehensive assessment plans on the Office of Assessment website. Again, I'm trying to build that and have it be useful. Right now, it's primarily focused toward academic assessment, but as I do these workshops, I'm posting things and having it be valuable for the whole community. So when we consider the assessment tools, there's several things we need to consider. Instrument validity. Is it measuring what we want it to measure? Is it a valid measurement? Reliability. Is it reliable? If we test today and give the same type of assessment tomorrow, is it going to measure the same thing? And is it reliable between raters? When we get to rubrics, we'll talk more about that. And then there are direct and indirect methods. We can, if we're assessing an RA, let's say Shelley or Jessica are assessing an RA, you're using a rubric. You're actually measuring that person on how well they're doing on a particular scale. An indirect method, we're asking that person, surveys, we're asking that person how they feel they're doing on that. So there's direct measurement and indirect measurement. Qualitative and quantitative, fairly self-explanatory. And formative and summative, we can measure or assess along the way in the formation of what's going on, or at the end, or both. So those are different elements to keep in mind when you're choosing tools for assessment, measuring your learning outcomes. I just want to take a minute to talk about direct assessment measurements. So again, it's based on a direct observation of knowledge or skills, and I just highlighted three areas here. When you do pre and post, I highlighted the pros and cons of 3 areas here. Pre and post evaluation, obviously the pros are that you get insight over time. You're measuring what's going on before and after. Cons are it can be labor intensive and your assessment tool needs to be able to be applicable for both the pre and post. For standardized tests, they're great. They've usually had their reliability checked, they're valid, oftentimes they're simple to administer and evaluate the results. The cons are they might not necessarily fit with your program and it could be costly. And then locally developed tests are, the pros to that are you can tailor it to your program. And the cons are you need to watch out for, develop reliability and validity, and it takes time to both develop the instruments, such as a rubric, and also to train people. So those are some considerations for direct. Indirect, again, a lot of you have had experience. We've talked before several times about surveys. The pros of surveys are they're fairly simple to administer. You hope you capture everyone you're surveying, but they're simple to administer. The cons are not necessarily valid because it's an indirect measurement. You're asking people how they perceive they've done, or how they feel. And there are different types of surveys. Self-efficacy, where they're rating themselves, satisfaction, attitudinal, and then alumni and employer. So good, we use them a lot, but they're not good for everything, on every aspect. And again, because we want to be multifaceted in our assessment of our programs, it's good to go beyond that. Exit interviews and focus groups are good as well. The pros are you get more in-depth information than just having someone fill out a survey when they don't, when they're either online or a little less connected. But the cons are time and labor intensive and maintaining anonymity. So, just wanted to highlight surveys again. Most of you have experience with surveys. It's an indirect measure resulting in qualitative and quantitative data depending on your questions. The response rates can be low. I don't know if you've found in the surveys you've done, incentivizing can be a challenge. They're relatively inexpensive, easy to administer, can reach a wide population, and then the data is easy to collect and tabulate, certainly the quantitative data. Okay, so the two, now we're going to talk about focus groups and rubrics. Crammed probably too much onto one slide, not a good thing. But how many of you have done focus groups? Great. And so you know that they're more time consuming. You have a smaller group that you're working with, so you can't necessarily generalize to a greater population. But the insight that you get, there's some real advantages to running focus groups, particularly if you're looking for a specific, if you're concentrating on a specific area. So usually the focus groups are small, 5 to 10 participants. You have to get informed consent. You need a note taker, some way to record responses, and then a facilitator. And the key, of course, is to have, each of those people are keys, but you need a note taker who's going to transcribe as accurately as possible, and then a skilled facilitator who can not only try to be unbiased, but follow up and guide with probing questions, clarifying questions, and try to make sure all the members in the group are willing to participate. The group demographics are another consideration. You have to be careful how you develop your groups, how you put together your groups. And in addition to watching out for what we call observer dependency, which is where the researcher or the person putting the results together could show some bias. You can run into groupthink and social desirability bias. So groupthink, obviously people are they're influenced by what others think and say, and may not be willing, or they get drawn into saying, oh yes, I agree with that too, or oh yes, I feel the same way. And then social desirability, searching to please, looking to please the group and the moderator. And then it's challenging to analyze the results because it's qualitative, strictly qualitative data. So we look at key findings, emerging themes, some of those issues. And again, with the focus groups, you're reporting on the group results, not necessarily the individual results. So when we analyze the results, we're doing inductive analysis. We're looking at identifying those themes, organizing the data into themes. And we'll talk more at the next session, which is going to be on reporting on qualitative data in December. We'll talk more about the actual reporting of that. But it's looking for the similarities and relationships, the contradictions that come up within the comments. There are software programs in the Office of Assessment. I don't use any software programs. I do it all. Just me. But there are some people on campus do use NVivo, and I know there are other software programs available to analyze qualitative data. And it does the same thing. It analyzes emerging themes, searches for keywords, that kind of thing. So one of the things that I believe is not recreating the wheel, and I did find, I want to hand this out to you, I did find this really good for and not good for. It defines the steps in putting together a focus group, advantages and disadvantages, and then really focuses on the different phases, conceptualizing. Why are you putting together a focus group? What plan do you have? What are your resources? You have to plan for resources. Who are you going to get to moderate, note take, the actual room, what rooms, obviously space is a challenge here at Bridgewater. So just some of those logistical pieces at the beginning. And then the interview phase, it goes through each of the steps in a focus group. So I don't need to go through this today, but I just wanted to give you this resource. It's a very good, detailed way to prepare for and run focus groups. So, any questions about focus groups? Or for those of you who have run focus groups, do you have other things you think might be important for people to know? It's really good if you want to delve into specific topics and find out more, really get insight as to why people think the way they do, or respond the way they do, or if you have a particular concern about your program that, why aren't people using the health center on Fridays?
I helped Kathy Holbrook when she was working with it was part of the Project Compass grant when they were doing the mentorship. So I was a note taker, and then what we found is it was better when we had 2 note takers. So the very first focus group, I was the only note taker, and I missed things. There's just so much going on. So for subsequent ones, we had 2 note takers, and that we got much better data from having 2 note takers.
Right, because we as note takers as well.
Yeah.
We have our own biases. So
yeah.
One of the roles of the moderator is to be sure that everyone's speaking slowly enough so that the note taker gets it. But depending on how quickly you are at note taking, that can be slow. I know for me, it's slow. So, and then there are issues. You can tape sessions if you get consent, but then you're capturing everything, which is.
What I found is at least the transcription tends to be a little more objective.
Yes, exactly.
But if you talk.
Exactly. Well, certainly you have to have a good reason. I think it's really important to make sure you know your reason for running a focus group. Right. Because the validity could be compromised with those issues. Okay. Now, rubrics are, for the most part, used as a direct measure. How many of you have used rubrics? Oh, good. So, it's usually a direct measure that's 2-dimensional. You're identifying the characteristics of what you're trying to measure, and then you're specifying the various levels of achievement. And a lot of us use rubrics without, certainly have in the past, without calling them rubrics, but essentially we're using rubrics. We know what the level is, we know what we're looking for, and we're identifying where someone falls on that level. So it does, the really nice thing about rubrics is it allows for, with good training, it allows for efficiency and consistency by being precise in the outcomes and the expectations. It's easily shared with those being scored. So in academic settings, certainly, if somebody's writing a paper, you can say to your students, here's the rubric on which you're going to be scored, and they know. There may be a little bit of room for interpretation, but they know what elements they're being scored. Development and training can be time-consuming, and then you can use either holistic or analytic rubrics, which I have another handout. So in the rubric development, there's something called a meta-rubric that you can use to judge the quality of your rubric. There's probably a meta-rubric to judge that. But I thought this is really good. Your rubric, you need to consider 4 parts to it. The content and the coverage. Does it cover everything that you want to cover? Does it cover everything you're trying to measure? Clarity. Are the terms defined? Are the various levels of quality defined? And are there samples to illustrate those levels? That really helps to make a strong rubric. Practicality, again, is it easy to use and understand? And then technical quality and fairness. Is it reliable? Is it valid? And is it fair? Meaning free of bias, free of as much bias as we can get rid of. And then to analyze the results of quantitative data, most of you know this, all of you know this, I'm sure. There's the descriptive statistics. 80% said this answer, 70% said that. So there's the frequency distributions, measures of central tendency, mean, median, mode, measures of dispersion. Other times we don't do that, but standard deviation, how, is everyone, how much of a deviation is there? And then measures of relationship, correlation. And then we use inferential statistical analysis where we look at the strength of the relationship between different groups. And typically we do that in SPSS, in assessment, and IR does it as well. But Qualtrics, we can run cross tabs in Qualtrics, which is really nice as well. So I found this out on the examples of holistic and analytic rubrics. And I think this really captures and gives an example of each. So a holistic rubric is where you're giving one overall score. And an analytic rubric is where you're giving scores on each of the components. So the first page just shows that basic difference without getting into a specific example. And then the second page shows a holistic rubric example for leadership. So it has 4 levels: novice, apprentice, proficient, and distinguished. Oftentimes we give numerical scoring for this. And we would score the person based on where they fall with all of those elements. Whereas the analytic rubric on the next page takes each of those elements and breaks it out into the 4 categories. So a holistic rubric's fine. An analytic rubric gives you a whole lot more information and you're able to take a look at the subcategories that much more. I had also shared a rubric scoring for RAs with residential life and housing. So I'm just going to hand this out, and this is public. It has someone's name on it, but only first name. It was done by Axiom Education. Kurt Mazer down at Fairfield University, and I think this is a really good example of a rubric. It gives an overall score. It allows the rater to measure the RA on each of the categories, and then so it gives the score, weights the score, gives an overall score. I thought that was a really good example as well. Any comments on rubrics? You have to make sure that you train your evaluators. Some of these things are fairly straightforward. Again, if you give examples, more examples, but if you give clear examples of the distinction between the different levels, then you have more consistent results with less explicit training. Any comments on rubrics? Sure.
I think just an example, going back to what you were talking about, that we use them sometimes and we don't even realize it. And so when assessments start to become more and more part of our daily language here in student affairs, we talked about, are there things within our department or division that we could use rubrics for that might give us a better sense of data? And so I did some research on rubrics and had looked up some things, and I got some examples back, and I was like, wait a minute, this is a rubric? I've been using this for 12 years. Exactly. I've been using something like that, we had been using it, but it goes back to, we always talk about, because we were using a rubric in, our group process day, for example, or for our candidate interviews coming for full-time staff positions. Those were rubrics. It just didn't, I think when you picture a rubric, or at least when I did, I pictured the square chart with the boxes, and you filled in a score necessarily, but the setup, because I know that when Felix was here and I was in the Assessment Institute, he had done a session on rubrics, and I was like, and that was one of the times that I thought, I've been using these for so long, it just doesn't look like that's what you would picture. And so as we were trying to develop some and use them, but it goes back, so there was that piece that I've been using them for so long, but the other part that we struggle with is training everyone on using the rubric correctly. And so, especially we're training 86 RAs going into an interview day on how to use this tool. And so, we we've noticed a difference. So for a little while, we were like, this is self-explanatory, you mark the boxes accordingly, you know, and then we were getting things back, and there were 2 people in the same room that gave them a 5 and a 1. How could you do that? Because I clearly defined, so what happened, like, did one of you leave the room? Because we clearly defined what a 1 was and a 5,
And what did
and
you
they were
find?
marking the same student. And so some of them, it was kind of, they felt it was more in their interpretation of what that said. And so part of it was clarifying how we described the ranking so that it was less subjective. You know, it couldn't be up to interpretation per se. So within maybe a point, you could find that.
Right.
So the training piece was key, and so we had to start doing some more ahead of time training and then morning of refresher training, and we get more consistent results and clarifying some of those things. But yeah, so it was just interesting that I think that people use them all the time, that you don't realize that as a rubric because it doesn't look like.
Right, because
what
now,
picture. Right.
rubrics are so prevalent, we think, oh, it has to be, you know, it has to be a table to be a rubric.
Yes.
But in fact, it's not. You're just you're just grading people on some
Right,
scale.
and you're defining the grade
Exactly.
within the Likert scale per se.
Some level of whatever your varying levels are for some criteria. That's it.
Yeah.
So it can look however you want it to look. Right?
Yeah.
It is interesting. But that's a good comment about training too, because we might think we're being clear in our examples in a rubric as well, but until we actually let people use the rubric, it's good to give it a test run. It's like the surveys. It's good to give it a test run. The focus groups, you can't give a test run, but, well, the questions you can. So rubrics are obviously good for situations in which you're grading. And then, of course, reviewing and discussing, this goes back to the assessment cycle. You compare your results to your intended outcomes, consider what other evidence you have, and then expand the conversation and put it together. Oftentimes you have to do a report. Sometimes if you're talking about hiring, you're not doing a report. And that's the thing. You're using the rubrics and the focus groups in so many different ways. Any other discussions, questions, or questions about Qualtrics? So next time, we're going to talk about qualitative data.
Yep.
Interpreting and reporting on qualitative.
Yes, our sneak peek so that everyone can mark their schedules is that December 12th, and this will go out in announcements as well, but December 12th, we're going to be in the ECC 113. We're going to talk about analyzing qualitative data. So we'll have some examples of results of focus group, rubrics, things like that we're going to show how to analyze them, and she's going to use the Student Affairs Assessment Report form so that when we're having these things, we know how to submit them and look that over. So she's had that information. And so the same thing, we'll provide delicious desserts of sorts, and so we're trying to spread them back and forth across campus to be fair to all. But December 12th, mark your calendars.
Absolutely. Good.
I have a question. On focus groups, we've tried in Residence Life to do focus groups with the RAs. We do exit interviews with departing RAs. And we used to do a survey, and we got some information on the survey. We tried doing one-on-one interviews, but some of them weren't happy coming in. So this past year we did focus groups, and I think of the 3 ways we've tried to do exit interviews, they were the most successful. Part of it for us is it's a captive audience. We did it during their staff meeting, so they needed to be there. But there is still, the bias is really hard. So basically, Shelley, myself, it was just the 2 of us. She took half the staff and I took half the staff. We know the groups need to be smaller than they were. We split them in half. But we're still sitting there where their bosses. So I'm wondering on campus if maybe as we go forward with our assessment agenda, should we be training people to be focus group facilitators so that if Mary Lou wants to do a focus group,
Yes.
I can go do hers for her and maybe she can come and do mine, because I think we're getting better. We got the best data we've ever gotten in the ways we've done our groups, but I know, as much as I know it was important to be non-biased, I know I got defensive by some of their answers.
Sure.
And so I started to talk and started to say, well, let me explain why we do that.
Right.
And then I know I changed the focus of the focus group. So I
Right,
guess
and you have a dynamic already set up because you have that relationship, so that's great.
So I'm wondering, as we move forward with focus groups, if other people are interested in, because I chair the Student Affairs Assessment Committee, is that maybe something that we could offer maybe even next semester, is some training for people, and then we could have a list of people in the division who are trained, so if somebody wants to do focus groups, we could borrow from each other?
Absolutely. So we ran a focus group, for example, Streams, the Streams project. We ran a faculty focus group, Felix and I, in the spring. And right, it definitely helps to have a bit of an outsider, someone where there's not a dynamic already established, because you, as the moderator or facilitator, you have your biases, and the participants have their biases. Yep. And I think that's a great idea. You do just have to make sure that your moderator or facilitator is knowledgeable enough about the topic to be able to feel comfortable with the clarifying and probing follow-up questions on that particular subject. So there's training not only to be a focus group moderator, note taker, or leader, and I think it makes a great deal of sense to build those groups on campus who are able to do that. But then be careful that they understand the concepts or the themes that are emerging, and be able to follow.
Yeah, and that was going to be the second part of the question would be, I think we did an okay job. We sat down and we went through the data. So Rita was one of our note takers. She worked with Shelley, I think, and I had Amanda from our office, or maybe the other way around. We each had a note taker, and we sat down and we think we did a good job of analyzing. But is that something that your office could help us with if we have the data?
Sure.
Because we think we developed some good themes, but I mean, it was really our first time really working with focus groups at that level.
Right.
So it'll be good having a session. Beth, you'll be there December 12th.
Yes.
So we'll learn a tip on how to better analyze our data as well, and then run it by you for like a second. You know what I mean?
Right. But do you want to send me that date, the one that you did?
Yeah, I can send
it
it
last spring. Sure.
I can send it to you.
That'd be great.
That's so funny. I'd be like, oh, send me all that. She's like, yeah,
bring it on.
Anyone else want it? Y'all said that?
The men's retreat did a student group a couple years ago, and so Cindy asked me. I was not part of the group, and she felt that I was going to get better data from that. So I was not experienced. I didn't have the training I probably should have had, but it still was very rich, and me not knowing anything about what they were doing. So the responses we got back were open and candid. I wasn't part of the experience. I did see what you described here as some of the group thing, where they would get on a topic and want to agree, and it really requires to keep people to kind of limit and make sure everybody has an opportunity to speak. Because we tend to go into lots of things where everyone should have a voice, and then some people have too much or less.
That's right.
Yeah.
There are the natural
topics. Yeah.
Or some are very forceful.
I didn't analyze it. Cindy analyzed it, but she felt it was extremely rich. So that might be one to look at as well.
Right, and that's the pro of it. That's the advantage of running a focus group, is that you get that rich insight. It's not necessarily, the validity is questionable, and you can't necessarily generalize to the greater population, but it's very rich data. So having a good listener and someone who really can see that group dynamic, I think that's a great idea, Beth, to do that training for focus group leaders and note takers.
Right.
What is the best way to source participants in focus groups without handpicking? I think even that process.
And that's exactly, and that's the other. You're not getting that representation. Right. You're not getting a random sample unless you, depending on your focus group. I mean, one of the reasons for doing a focus group is because you're looking for certain.
Like I'm just thinking, if we were to do a focus group on why do students not participate in internships, that's the majority of our students. And that could be anyone here. So, is there a way to incentivize with a general survey to get participants, or are there ways that you recommend to get a pool without hands-on?
Right, and again, so that's a great question, because participating in internships, you're probably looking for upperclassmen more so.
Yeah, it could be juniors and seniors, the ones who did not apply. I'm just thinking out loud as an example.
Right, and would you want to take a look by subject area, by major?
Well, we certainly could. It's not something we're doing. But,
Right. No, but those are some of the
I think
things.
identifying, probably narrowing it down would help you get a better source. But even in contact, do you recommend, to sign
Food.
up, that kind of thing? What are the recommendations?
It's usually food.
Food, okay. Yeah.
To get them to participate. I mean, you can say we're interested in your opinion, it's valuable to us, we want to make our program better, usually with students, some sort of.
And then through email or through some sort of
I
announcement.
think targeting with focus groups, you do want to really target your population as much as possible, and maybe handpicking is the way to go.
Or at least excluding groups that skew your conversation.
Right, because you want the group to have some homogeneity so that they're at least comfortable talking with each other. I have something to consider. Beth, yeah, I'll look at the trainings. Maybe we can set up some trainings for that.
Yeah, I think that'd be a great resource.
Right.
I think in the example I gave, that the RAs may have felt a little freer to share things they weren't happy with to a stranger,
Absolutely.
to them, rather than to us,
Well, particularly, and we're human, but particularly if you started to react at all.
Yeah, and I know I did. I tried not to.
Right.
But there were times I was like, well, let me tell you why you do it that way. And I was like, oh, stop talking.
Exactly. And once you do that, they of course feel.
Then I think it's a question and answer session.
Right. Great.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
coming in. This was very helpful.